Police officer arrests black woman, stealing at airport, but she said one sentence. Everyone shuts up. In this riveting video, we delve into a dramatic encounter at a bustling airport, where a seemingly routine arrest takes an unexpected turn. A police officer detains a black woman suspected of theft, but the situation quickly evolves in an unforeseen direction. As tensions rise and onlookers gather, the atmosphere becomes charged with anticipation and curiosity. If you are enthusiastic about this narrative, please inform us. If you appreciated the video, press 1. If not, select 0. Your feedback genuinely motivates me to collect additional uplifting and significant narratives. The way we see the world. David Johnson adjusted her blazer, blending seamlessly into the flow of passengers boarding Flight 827. Despite her high-ranking position as Director of Public Relations at Summit Airlines, today, she was just another traveler. The airline had been facing a cascade of customer complaints lately, and she had decided to experience the service firsthand. There was no entourage, no briefing documents, just a seat in first class and her sharp observational skills. The cabin hummed with quiet luxury, leather seats, soft lighting, and attendants flashing polite practice smiles. David settled into 2A, a corner seat offering an unobstructed view of the crew's activity. She was here to observe, not interfere. It was a simple mission, or so she thought. Across the aisle, a sharply dressed man in his late 40s wrestled with his briefcase, grumbling about delayed flights and incompetent staff. His booming voice cut through the serene atmosphere, earning the occasional glance from other passengers. Behind him, Captain Michael Hartley strode in, exuding the confidence of someone who'd spent decades in the cockpit. His crisp uniform and square jaw gave him an authoritative air, but there was an edge to his demeanor, a faint impatience that seemed to color his every move. David watched him interact with the crew. His tone was clipped, bordering on dismissive. When a young flight attendant hesitated over a question about the safety procedures, Hartley's eyes narrowed. "It's not rocket science," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for her to hear. The attendant's cheeks flushed as she nodded and moved away. David made a mental note. Leadership was as much about demeanor as skill, and Hartley's attitude could easily tip the balance from respect to resentment. She returned her attention to her tablet, but her ears stayed tuned to the low hum of cabin activity. The flight took off smoothly, and for the first hour, everything seemed routine. The businessman across the aisle continued to bark demands at the flight attendants, requesting multiple drinks, adjusting his seat repeatedly, and growing visibly irritated when he felt the service wasn't fast enough. David remained a silent observer, sipping her water and scrolling through emails. Then, the atmosphere shifted. The businessman shot out of his seat, his face red with anger. "My wallet's gone!" he bellowed, holding up his briefcase as if it were Exhibit A in a courtroom drama. "It was right here. Someone's stolen it." The cabin fell silent. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances while the crew scrambled to calm the man down. David sighed inwardly, bracing for the disruption this would cause. Hartley emerged from the cockpit, his expression stony. "What seems to be the problem?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "This is the problem," the businessman said, jabbing a finger at his open briefcase. "My wallet is gone, and someone here took it." Hartley's gaze swept over the cabin, landing briefly on David before moving on. He turned to the flight attendants. "Search the immediate area," he ordered. "We can't have theft on board." David leaned back, observing the unfolding drama. She didn't plan to intervene unless absolutely necessary, but something about Hartley's approach put her on edge. His voice, his body language, they carried an implicit bias that made her stomach tighten. The attendant searched the area, turning up nothing. But the businessman wasn't satisfied. "Check the passengers," he demanded. "Someone's hiding it." David could see where this was going. Sure enough, Hartley's gaze returned to her. His expression hardened slightly, as if he'd already made up his mind. "Ma'am," he said, stepping toward her, "we need to check your belongings." David's brows lifted. She met his eyes without flinching. "And what's the basis for that?" she asked evenly. Hartley didn't flinch either. "Standard procedure. You were seated closest to the claimant. It's nothing personal." "Of course," she replied, her tone cool. She opened her purse and handed it over without protest, her movements deliberate. Hartley rifled through the contents with an air of barely concealed suspicion. Finding nothing, he returned it to her with a curt nod. "Apologies for the inconvenience," he said, though the words rang hollow. The businessman's wallet was eventually found, tucked beneath his own seat cushion. He offered a sheepish apology to the crew, but avoided looking at David. Hartley, however, didn't seem to register the implications of his actions. He simply returned to the cockpit without a word. David sat back in her seat, her expression unreadable. She didn't need to say anything now. Her role here wasn't to escalate. But she made another mental note, this one far more serious. Captain Hartley had just revealed more about himself than he likely intended, and David wasn't going to forget it. As the plane leveled off, David returned to her tablet. The businessman quieted down, and the flight attendants resumed their tasks, their smiles a little more strained than before. But the undercurrent of tension lingered. David could feel it in the glances exchanged between crew members and in the stiff, overly formal interactions between Hartley and the passengers. She had come on this flight to evaluate customer service, but what she had just witnessed was far more significant. Leadership, trust, and bias. All had been laid bare in the span of a single confrontation. And while she hadn't planned to make her presence known, David was beginning to suspect that staying incognito might no longer be an option. The wheels of the plane touched down at their destination, and David disembarked like any other passenger. But her mind was already working, crafting a plan for what came next. She hadn't just observed a problem, she had become a part of the story. David stepped off the plane with an outward calm, but the encounter with Captain Hartley lingered in her mind. She had endured moments like that before, microaggressions wrapped in professionalism. But this one felt different. Hartley's authority had cast a shadow over the entire cabin, and the businessman's baseless accusations had set the stage for a conflict that seemed far from over. By the time she arrived at her connecting gate, her phone buzzed. It was an automated email from Summit Airlines, thanking her for her recent flight. She smirked, knowing this routine email would lead to far more than a casual customer service survey. David found a quiet corner of the airport lounge, opened her laptop, and began typing. As Director of Public Relations, she knew the value of documenting incidents while they were fresh. Every detail was preserved. Hartley's curt tone, his assumption of guilt, the businessman's false accusations. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she captured the sequence of events, knowing this could become a pivotal case study for the airline's training programs. But her instincts told her this was bigger than one flight. It wasn't just about Hartley's poor judgment. It was about the culture that enabled it. David's suspicions were confirmed later that evening when she received a message from Mia, the flight attendant who had subtly warned her during the flight. The young woman's tone was cautious but resolute. "Hi, Ms. Johnson," the message began. "I hope this isn't inappropriate, but I feel like I need to tell you something. Captain Hartley has been involved in similar incidents before. This wasn't the first time he's made assumptions about passengers. I didn't want to speak up earlier because, well, you've seen how he is." The words hit like a punch. David had guessed there was a pattern, but now she had confirmation. She responded quickly, asking Mia to elaborate when she felt safe to do so. "Let me think about it," Mia replied. "I've seen enough to know something needs to change, but I have to be careful." David understood. As much as she wanted Mia to speak up, the risks for frontline employees were often too high. Hartley wasn't just a captain. He was a symbol of unchecked authority. David knew she'd have to proceed carefully if she wanted to dismantle the system that allowed him to thrive. 2 days later, David was back in her office, scrolling through an internal company database. She searched Hartley's employee file, hoping to find records of complaints or performance issues. But what she found instead was a sanitized version of his career. Glowing reviews, promotions, and commendations from upper management. It was almost as if the man she'd encountered on Flight 827 didn't exist. Frustrated but not surprised, David turned her attention to informal channels. She sent an encrypted message to Marcus Yates, Summit Airlines legal counsel, and one of the few people she trusted completely within the organization. "Marcus," she wrote, "I need your help looking into something. It's sensitive, but I think it's important. Within hours, Marcus was sitting across from her in her office, his brow furrowed. "This sounds messy," he said after David recounted the incident. "Hartley has been with the company for nearly 20 years. If he's been getting away with this for that long, it's not just about him. It's about everyone who's protected him." David nodded. "Exactly. And that's what worries me. If we don't handle this right, it could blow up in our faces." Marcus leaned back in his chair, considering. "Do you have any allies? People on the ground who might be willing to talk?" David hesitated, thinking of Mia. "There's one, but she's scared. She won't come forward unless we can guarantee she won't face retaliation." "Then we'll have to build a case another way," Marcus said. "Start with policy violations, dig into past incidents, and see if there's a pattern we can document. If this goes public, we need to be ready." Later that week, David received another message from Mia. This time, it was more direct. "I've decided I want to help," Mia wrote. "There are things I've seen, things I've kept quiet about because I didn't think anyone would listen. But after what happened on your flight, I can't stay silent anymore." Mia described incidents where Hartley had singled out passengers based on their appearance, often assuming the worst of people who didn't fit his idea of who belonged in first class. She recounted one instance where he had forced a family of South Asian descent to undergo extra security checks mid-flight, despite having no evidence of wrongdoing. In another, he had berated a female passenger for questioning his authority, calling her hysterical in front of the entire cabin. David listened quietly, taking notes. When Mia finished, her voice trembled. "Do you think this will actually change anything?" "It will," David assured her. "But it's going to take time and it's going to be hard. Are you ready for that?" Mia nodded. "I think so. As long as I'm not the only one." "You're not," David said firmly. With Mia's testimony and her own documentation, David began building a case. She knew this wouldn't stay internal for long. Hartley wasn't just a problem for Summit Airlines. He was a liability waiting to explode. Marcus worked alongside her, combing through past flight logs and interviewing employees who had worked under Hartley's command. Patterns began to emerge: unreported complaints, hushed incidents, and a culture of fear that allowed Hartley to operate without consequences. David and Marcus crafted a strategy. First, present their findings to senior leadership and push for immediate action. If that failed, they would take it to the board. And if the board resisted, there was always the media. But David hoped it wouldn't come to that. The airline's reputation was already fragile, and a public scandal could be catastrophic. She needed the executives to understand that addressing this issue wasn't just the right thing to do. It was the only way to protect the company's future. As she prepared for the next step, David couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Hartley might be the face of the problem, but the deeper issue was the system that had allowed him to flourish. Tackling that would take more than a few meetings and a policy update. It would take a fight. And David was ready for it. David didn't have to wait long for the repercussions. Her quiet inquiry into Captain Hartley's record had sent ripples through the airline's leadership. What she didn't anticipate, however, was how quickly those ripples would turn into waves. 2 days after she and Marcus began their investigation, David found herself scheduled on another flight, this time to attend a high-profile PR event in Denver. She hadn't thought much of it. It was a routine part of her role. But as she boarded the plane, her instincts flared. Standing at the cockpit door, greeting passengers, was none other than Captain Hartley. Their eyes met for a split second. His lips curved into a polite smile, but his eyes held a flicker of recognition and something colder, more calculated. David suppressed the urge to react. She stepped into the cabin and took her seat, mentally preparing herself for what could very well become another ordeal. She had already filed a formal report against Hartley, but it was still under internal review. Now she was on his flight again, and it felt less like coincidence and more like a deliberate move. The flight began smoothly enough, but the tension in the air was palpable. David noticed small things. The flight attendant seemed unusually stiff, glancing at her with a mix of curiosity and unease. Passengers in the row behind her murmured quietly, their voices low but their eyes occasionally flicking toward her. She stayed calm, focusing on her laptop and the work in front of her. But halfway through the flight, the first crack appeared. A middle-aged woman seated in economy class stood up, looking agitated. "Excuse me," she called to a flight attendant. "My bag isn't where I left it. Someone must have moved it." The flight attendant reassured her and began checking the overhead bins, but the situation escalated quickly. Another passenger chimed in, claiming that their carry-on had been moved as well. A small commotion began to build, and the murmurs in the cabin grew louder. Captain Hartley emerged from the cockpit, his expression stern. "What's going on here?" he demanded. The flight attendant quickly explained the situation, but Hartley's gaze shifted, landing directly on David. His jaw tightened. "Let's not waste time," he said curtly. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to let us inspect your belongings." David closed her laptop slowly, meeting his gaze with a calm she didn't entirely feel. "And why would you need to do that, Captain?" Hartley's expression didn't waver. "We're investigating a possible security concern. It's standard procedure." David's voice remained even, but there was steel in her tone. Standard procedure involves treating passengers equally, not singling them out without cause. The tension in the cabin thickened as passengers turned to watch the confrontation. David could feel the weight of their stares, some sympathetic, others skeptical. She held her ground, refusing to let Hartley intimidate her. "Captain," she said, her voice carrying just enough authority to draw attention, "I think we both know this has nothing to do with security and everything to do with retaliation." For a moment, Hartley looked taken aback, but he quickly recovered. "I'm just doing my job," he said coldly. "If you have an issue, feel free to take it up with the airline after the flight." David leaned back in her seat, her expression unreadable. "Oh, I will." The rest of the flight passed in a tense, uneasy silence. Hartley returned to the cockpit, but the damage was done. The passengers continued to whisper among themselves, and the flight attendants avoided David's row altogether. When the plane finally landed in Denver, David was among the last to disembark. As she stepped into the terminal, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Marcus. "He's trying to bait you. Be careful. I've heard from HR. They've already received an unofficial complaint about your behavior on this flight." Hartley's covering his tracks. David exhaled sharply. She had expected resistance, but she hadn't anticipated Hartley's willingness to escalate so openly. Back in her hotel room that evening, David replayed the events of the day in her mind. It was clear that Hartley wasn't just defending himself. He was going on the offensive. The so-called complaint against her was a strategic move, likely designed to paint her as the aggressor and undermine her credibility. She called Marcus to discuss their next steps. "He's not acting alone," Marcus said. "Someone higher up is giving him cover. We need to figure out who." "I agree," David said. "But first, we need to neutralize his narrative. If he's accusing me of being a disruptive passenger, we need witnesses who can refute that." "I'll start with the flight attendants," Marcus offered. "They're the most likely to have seen what really happened." David hesitated. "Be careful. They're under his command, and he's clearly not above using intimidation." Marcus's voice softened. "I'll tread lightly. But David, you need to prepare yourself. This isn't just about Hartley anymore. It's about the culture he represents. Taking him down might be the start, but the fight ahead is going to get a lot bigger." David closed her eyes, exhaustion creeping in. "I know," she said quietly, "but we can't stop now. If we back down, it'll only get worse, for everyone." The next morning, David received another message, this time from Mia. "I heard about what happened on your flight," Mia wrote. "Word travels fast in the crew network. A lot of us are rooting for you, but some are scared. Hartley has a reputation, and not just with passengers. He's been known to retaliate against anyone who speaks out." David's heart sank. She had hoped Mia's bravery might inspire others, but the shadow Hartley cast was clearly larger than she realized. She typed back a quick response. "Thank you for letting me know. I understand why people are hesitant, but I need you to keep documenting everything you see. The more evidence we have, the stronger our case will be." Mia's reply came almost immediately. "I'll do my best. Just promise me one thing. Don't let him win." David stared at the screen for a long moment. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for Mia, for the flight attendants who lived in fear of retaliation, and for the passengers who deserved better. The fight was getting personal, and Hartley wasn't going to make it easy. But David wasn't backing down. Not now. David's determination to confront the culture enabling Captain Hartley's behavior solidified further after her turbulent flight to Denver. But she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just a battle in the air. It was one she'd need to fight on the ground with facts, allies, and strategy. The opportunity to escalate the issue came sooner than expected. 2 days after the Denver incident, David received a message from Summit Airlines operational headquarters. It wasn't the HR department, as she had hoped. Instead, it was from the director of flight operations, urging her to meet with Hartley at the Dallas hub for a debriefing. "Let me guess," Marcus said over the phone when she called him. "They want to make this go away quietly." "That's exactly what it feels like," David replied. "They want to control the narrative before it gets out of hand. But I'm not walking into a room with Hartley alone." "You won't have to," Marcus assured her. "I'll be there, and we'll use this to get their full attention. If Hartley shows his true colors again, we document it." When David arrived at the Dallas Hub's conference center, it was clear that tensions were already brewing. Hartley was waiting just outside the glass-walled meeting room, arms crossed, his posture exuding defiance. His uniform was immaculate, but his stiff expression betrayed his growing unease. David's presence only added to it. When their eyes met, he gave her the kind of tight-lipped smile that was meant to disarm, but failed to hide his frustration. Marcus stepped forward, clipboard in hand, and greeted Hartley with cool professionalism. "Captain Hartley, we're here to ensure this meeting is productive and focused on resolving the underlying issues. Let's get started." Hartley barely acknowledged him and strode into the room. David followed, her gaze steady, refusing to let him intimidate her. The director of flight operations, a man named Robert Trent, sat at the head of the table. He was flanked by 2 assistants, their laptops open and ready to take notes. "Thank you all for coming," Trent began, his tone neutral but carefully measured. "We're here to address the recent concerns raised by Ms. Johnson and ensure that Summit Airlines maintains the highest standards of professionalism and fairness for both employees and passengers." Hartley's jaw tightened, but he remained silent as Trent continued. "Captain, Ms. Johnson has expressed concerns about your handling of certain situations on recent flights, particularly the Denver route. Do you have anything you'd like to address before we review the details?" Hartley leaned back in his chair, arms folded. "I've been with Summit Airlines for 20 years. My record speaks for itself. If we're here because of one passenger's misunderstanding, then I think we're blowing this out of proportion." David raised an eyebrow, but let Marcus take the lead. "Captain Hartley," Marcus began, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't about a single misunderstanding. It's about a pattern of behavior that's been reported by multiple employees and passengers over the years. Mrs. Johnson's recent experience only highlights the need for a deeper look into the underlying issues." Trent shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for this direct approach. "Let's stay on topic," he said quickly. "Ms. Johnson, can you clarify your concerns regarding the Denver flight?" David leaned forward, her tone steady but pointed. "During the flight, Captain Hartley directed a baseless security check against me in front of other passengers, despite having no evidence or cause. This wasn't an isolated incident. His behavior reflects a troubling bias that undermines the trust passengers place in our airline." Hartley scoffed, shaking his head. "That's a serious accusation, Ms. Johnson. If you felt inconvenienced, I apologize, but my decisions were made in the interest of flight security." "Inconvenienced?" David repeated, her voice firm. "Captain, your decisions weren't based on security. They were based on assumptions. You targeted me because I didn't fit your idea of who belongs in first class. That's not just unprofessional, it's discriminatory." The room fell silent. Trent's assistants exchanged uneasy glances, while Hartley's expression darkened. "I've heard enough," Hartley snapped, leaning forward. "You've been targeting me since the moment you stepped on my plane. This is personal, not professional." David didn't flinch. "This isn't about you, Captain. It's about the standards we hold ourselves to as a company. If you can't see that, then you're proving my point." Trent cleared his throat, stepping in before the exchange escalated further. "This is getting heated. Let's focus on resolving this constructively." But before Trent could redirect the conversation, Marcus interjected. "Actually, Mr. Trent, we believe resolving this constructively starts with accountability. We've gathered testimonies from other employees who've witnessed similar behavior from Captain Hartley. These accounts, combined with the reports that HR has failed to act on, paint a clear picture of a systemic issue that goes beyond one flight. Trent stiffened. "What exactly are you implying?" David answered, her voice steady. "I'm implying that Captain Hartley's behavior is symptomatic of a larger problem, one that's been allowed to fester because complaints haven't been properly addressed. This isn't just about one captain. It's about ensuring that every employee and passenger is treated with respect and dignity." Hartley stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I won't sit here and listen to these baseless attacks. If you want to ruin someone's career, Ms. Johnson, congratulations. You've chosen the wrong target." "Captain, sit down," Trent ordered, his voice firm for the first time. Hartley hesitated but complied, his face flushed with anger. Trent turned to David. "I understand your concerns, Ms. Johnson, and I take them seriously. But these are serious allegations, and we need time to review the evidence before making any decisions." Marcus leaned forward. "Mr. Trent, while you're reviewing the evidence, I'd like to remind you that this issue doesn't just affect Summit Airlines' internal culture, it affects its public reputation. If the media were to get hold of these patterns, the fallout could be significant." Trent paled slightly, but nodded. "Understood. Let's proceed carefully." After the meeting adjourned, David and Marcus walked out into the bright sunlight of the Dallas tarmac. "That went about as well as I expected," Marcus said dryly. David exhaled, tension still thrumming through her veins. Hartley's not going to back down. And Trent's too focused on damage control to actually take action. Marcus nodded. "Then we keep pushing. The more evidence we gather, the harder it'll be for them to ignore." As they reached the terminal, David's phone buzzed with another message from Mia. "Be careful," Mia wrote. "Hartley's already rallying support from other captains. He's claiming you're out to ruin the company." David sighed, her resolve hardening. "Let him talk," she muttered. "The truth will speak louder than his excuses." Marcus glanced at her, a small smile playing on his lips. "That's the spirit. Now let's see just how far they're willing to go to protect him." David nodded, already thinking ahead. This fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. David had expected the fallout from her meeting with Captain Hartley and the leadership team. But the magnitude of the resistance still took her by surprise. Over the following days, whispers spread through Summit Airlines offices, staff lounges, and flight decks. Hartley wasn't just defending himself. He was leveraging his decades-long connections within the company to discredit her. The internal grapevine carried rumors of David being a troublemaker, someone out to create division in a company already stretched thin. Hartley, it seemed, had friends in high places, and they were working quietly to shield him from the consequences of his actions. But David wasn't easily deterred. She had Marcus on her side, and the evidence they were compiling was too damning to ignore. In a small office at Summit Airlines headquarters, David sat across from Marcus, sifting through files. Her laptop screen displayed charts and spreadsheets, data Marcus had pieced together from internal HR records and anonymous complaints submitted by employees over the past 5 years. "What we have here is a clear pattern," Marcus said, pointing to one spreadsheet. "Over a dozen complaints involving Hartley, all dismissed as misunderstandings or lack of evidence. And that's just what was officially recorded. Mia's testimony suggests there are more cases that never made it to HR." David leaned back in her chair, her brow furrowed. "And it's not just him. Look at these other names," she said, scrolling through the data. "Several senior pilots have similar complaint histories. This isn't just a Hartley problem. It's a systemic failure to hold people accountable." Marcus nodded. "It's worse than that. The HR department itself seems complicit. They've repeatedly downplayed or ignored these reports, likely to avoid the hassle of dealing with senior staff. They've prioritized protecting the company's image over creating a safe environment for employees and passengers." The two sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the problem sinking in. "So, what's the next move?" Marcus asked. "We take this higher," David said firmly. "Hartley's not acting alone, and we need the board to understand how deep this goes. If they don't act, we'll have to consider other options, like going public." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "That's a nuclear option, David. If you blow this wide open, you'll put your career on the line." David met his gaze unwavering. "If it comes to that, I'm ready. This isn't just about me. It's about every employee who's been silenced and every passenger who's been mistreated. If I don't fight for them, who will? The next day, David scheduled a meeting with Robert Trent, the director of flight operations. She wasn't expecting much, but she needed to lay her cards on the table before escalating the matter to the board. Trent greeted her with a strained smile as she entered his office. "Ms. Johnson," he said, gesturing to a chair, "thank you for coming. I understand you've been looking into Captain Hartley's record." "That's correct," David said, sitting down. "And what I've found is deeply concerning. There's a clear pattern of bias and misconduct, not just by Hartley, but across several senior staff members. Worse, the company's response to these complaints has been inadequate at best and deliberately dismissive at worst." Trent's expression tightened. "I appreciate your concerns, but you have to understand the context. Senior pilots like Hartley are critical to our operations. They've been with the company for decades. Their experience and reputation carry weight, and sometimes complaints are exaggerated or made in bad faith." David's jaw clenched, but she kept her tone steady. "With all due respect, Mr. Trent, that kind of thinking is exactly why we're in this situation. Protecting senior staff at the expense of accountability only perpetuates the problem. This isn't about one or two isolated incidents. It's about a culture that tolerates misconduct because it's easier than addressing it." Trent leaned back, clearly uncomfortable. "What exactly are you asking for, Ms. Johnson?" "I'm asking for action," David said. "I want a full investigation into these complaints, not just against Hartley, but against anyone with similar records. And I want transparency. No more sweeping things under the rug." Trent hesitated, then sighed. "I'll take your concerns to the executive team, but you have to understand, these things take time. We can't overhaul the system overnight." David stood, her voice firm but polite. "I'm not asking for overnight change, Mr. Trent. I'm asking for a commitment to start. The longer we wait, the more damage we do to our employees, our passengers, and our reputation." That evening, David received a call from Mia. "Hi, Ms. Johnson," Mia said hesitantly. "I just wanted to let you know. Things are getting tense among the crew. People are talking about what you're doing, and not everyone's happy about it." "I'm not surprised," David said gently. "Change is hard, and some people are always going to resist it." "It's not just resistance," Mia continued. "Some people are scared. They think if Hartley gets taken down, it'll open the floodgates, and a lot of people could lose their jobs." David sighed. "That's exactly what the leadership is counting on. They're using fear to keep people in line. But if we don't address this now, things will only get worse in the long run." "I know," Mia said quietly. "I just wanted you to know what you're up against." "Thank you, Mia," David said. "And thank you for your courage. You've done more than most people would, and that means a lot." The next morning, David met with Marcus again to prepare their case for the board. They compiled everything: the data from HR, the testimonies from employees, and a detailed analysis of how these systemic failures were affecting the airline's operations and reputation. "This is solid," Marcus said, reviewing their presentation. "If the board doesn't act on this, they're blind. They won't be able to ignore it," David agreed. "And if they try, we'll make sure the public knows what's happening." Marcus looked at her, a hint of admiration in his eyes. "You're not just fighting for accountability. You're fighting to change the culture. That's not easy, David." "I know," she said quietly. "But it's worth it." When the day of the board meeting arrived, David walked into the conference room with her head held high. Hartley wasn't present. This wasn't about him anymore. This was about a system that had allowed people like him to operate unchecked. As she stood before the board presenting her findings, she felt the weight of every employee and passenger who had ever been silenced or mistreated. This wasn't just her fight. It was theirs too. By the time she finished, the room was silent. The board members exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of shock and discomfort. "Thank you, Ms. Johnson," the chairman said finally. "We'll need time to review this, but I assure you, we take these matters seriously." David nodded, but she wasn't satisfied. Words were easy. Action was harder. And she was determined to see this through, no matter how long it took. The boardroom was unusually quiet as the members filed in, their faces betraying a mix of unease and skepticism. David sat at one end of the long oak table, her notes organized into neat piles in front of her. Marcus was at her side, his steady presence a silent reassurance. This was the moment they had prepared for. A chance to push the airline's leadership into action. The chairman, a silver-haired man named Alan Brewster, called the meeting to order. Ms. Johnson, thank you for bringing these concerns to our attention. You've been given the floor to outline your findings. Please proceed. David rose, meeting the gaze of each board member in turn. Thank you, Mr. Brewster. Over the past several weeks, my team and I have conducted a thorough review of Summit Airlines' handling of complaints related to employee misconduct. What we've uncovered is troubling. A pattern of systemic failures that not only compromise employee safety and morale, but also put our passengers and our brand reputation at risk. She clicked a remote, and the first slide of her presentation lit up the screen behind her. It was a graph showing a sharp rise in misconduct complaints over the past 5 years, contrasted with a stagnant rate of formal investigations. This data, she continued, comes directly from our HR records. While complaints have increased by 40%, the percentage of those complaints that result in any form of disciplinary action has remained below 10%. In many cases, the complaints are dismissed outright, often with little or no follow-up. A murmur rippled through the room. Brewster raised a hand, signaling for silence. Do you have specific examples to support this? David nodded and gestured to Marcus, who distributed printed packets to the board members. Contained in these packets are anonymized case summaries, including one particularly egregious example. A captain with over a dozen formal complaints, ranging from discriminatory behavior toward passengers to intimidation of crew members. Despite this, he has not faced a single disciplinary action and continues to operate flights. The mention of Captain Hartley hung in the air, unspoken but understood. One board member, a stern-faced woman named Claire Donovan, flipped through the packet with visible discomfort. This raises serious concerns. But how do we know these complaints are credible? Couldn't some of them be exaggerated or fabricated? David anticipated this question. We've corroborated multiple complaints through employee testimonies. Additionally, several incidents align with passenger reports, which are available in customer feedback logs. This isn't a matter of isolated grievances. It's a pattern that reflects a broader cultural issue. As the presentation continued, David outlined the systemic failures that allowed misconduct to persist: insufficient training for leadership, lack of accountability mechanisms, and an HR department more focused on damage control than meaningful action. She ended with a clear recommendation: a comprehensive overhaul of Summit Airlines' internal policies, including mandatory bias training, a confidential reporting system for employees, and an independent task force to review past complaints. Change isn't optional, she concluded. It's necessary if we want to restore trust, not just with our employees, but with our passengers. Summit Airlines prides itself on being a leader in the industry. This is our chance to prove it. When she finished, the room fell into a heavy silence. Brewster removed his glasses, massaging the bridge of his nose. This is a lot to process, he said finally. You've raised important points, Ms. Johnson, but implementing these changes will be costly and time-consuming. How do you propose we balance this with maintaining profitability? Marcus spoke up, his tone calm but firm. Mr. Brewster, the cost of inaction will be far greater. If this information were to become public, it could lead to lawsuits, regulatory scrutiny, and a significant loss of customer trust. Investing in these changes now is the only way to protect the company in the long term. Brewster frowned but nodded. Fair point. However, I'd like to hear from the rest of the board before making any decisions. What followed was an hour of heated debate. Some board members supported David's recommendations, arguing that the company's reputation depended on swift action. Others, like Donovan, were more hesitant, citing concerns about the financial and operational challenges of implementing such sweeping changes. At one point, the discussion veered dangerously close to personal attacks. Let's not forget, Donovan said sharply, that Ms. Johnson has a vested interest in this matter. She's the one who initiated the investigation, and her perspective may not be entirely objective. David stiffened but kept her composure. Ms. Donovan, she said evenly, my vested interest is ensuring this company upholds the values it claims to represent. This isn't about me. It's about the integrity of our organization and the people we serve. Brewster intervened before the exchange could escalate further. Let's stay focused on the bigger picture. Ms. Johnson, do you have a timeline for these proposed changes? David nodded. If we begin immediately, the task force could be operational within 2 months. Training programs can be rolled out within 6 months, and we can start reviewing past complaints within the same time frame. It won't be easy, but it's achievable with the right commitment. As the meeting drew to a close, Brewster turned to the board. I believe we've heard enough to make an informed decision. Let's take a vote. The result was split, but leaned in David's favor. By a narrow majority, the board approved the creation of the independent task force and the implementation of bias training. It's a start, Brewster said as the vote was finalized. But I want regular updates on the progress of these initiatives. Ms. Johnson, I trust you'll oversee this personally. Of course, David replied, her voice steady despite the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. After the meeting, David and Marcus stepped out into the hallway, both exhausted but relieved. That could have gone worse, Marcus said with a faint smile. It could have gone better, David countered. There's still resistance, and Hartley isn't going to take this lying down. We've only won the first battle, Marcus nodded. True, but now you have the board's backing. That's a powerful position to be in. David allowed herself a small smile. Let's hope it's enough. As they left the building, David's phone buzzed with a message from Mia. Thank you for standing up for us, it read. We're starting to see that change is possible. David stared at the screen for a moment before replying. It's only the beginning. Stay strong. The battle in the boardroom was over, but David knew the real fight was just beginning. Implementing change was never easy, especially in an institution as entrenched as Summit Airlines. But she was prepared to see it through, no matter how many challenges lay ahead. The board's narrow approval of David's recommendations felt like a victory, but it was a fragile one. Implementation would take months, and in the meantime, the situation threatened to spiral out of control. Captain Hartley had not been idle. Within days of the board meeting, whispers of discontent turned into outright defiance. Some senior pilots rallied behind him, accusing David of trying to undermine the aviation community. Anonymous messages circulated among staff, claiming she was pushing an agenda to tarnish the company's legacy. When one of those messages leaked to the press, David's fight became public. The first headline appeared on a major news site. Internal turmoil at Summit Airlines. Discrimination allegations rock senior leadership. David's phone buzzed incessantly as colleagues, reporters, and even passengers reached out for comments. By the end of the day, the story had been picked up by several outlets, each adding their own sensational twist. Summit's PR department is already in overdrive, Marcus said during a late-night call. They're spinning this as an internal review to ensure operational excellence, but it's not going to hold. The media smells blood. David sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. They're not wrong to dig deeper. This needs to come to light. But on our terms, if we let Hartley's allies control the narrative, we'll lose the public's trust before we've even had a chance to act. Marcus paused. You're suggesting we go public ourselves? Yes, David said firmly. If the media already knows something is wrong, we need to take control of the story. Let's show the public that Summit Airlines is willing to own up to its mistakes and make real changes. The next day, David sat in her office, drafting a statement. Every word mattered. She knew this wasn't just about damage control. It was about setting a tone for the future. After several revisions and input from Marcus, the statement was ready. The headline was simple but powerful. A message from Summit Airlines, commitment to accountability and change. In it, David acknowledged the company's shortcomings, citing specific steps being taken to address systemic issues. She emphasized transparency, promising regular updates on the progress of the task force and training programs. The statement ended with a personal note. As Director of Public Relations, I want to personally assure our employees and passengers that this is not about blame. It's about progress. We are committed to building an airline that treats everyone with dignity and respect, both in the air and on the ground. The statement went live on the company's website and social media channels the following morning. Within hours, the response began pouring in. News outlets seized on the statement, and while some were critical, many commended the airline's willingness to address the issue publicly. Passengers shared their own stories of both positive and negative experiences, flooding Summit Airlines' social media pages with comments. "Transparency is key," Marcus said as he and David reviewed the reactions. "Even the skeptics are taking note. It's better to face criticism head-on than let Hartley and his allies twist the narrative." But not everyone was supportive. Hartley's faction doubled down, feeding the press stories about David's alleged witch hunt and framing her actions as a personal vendetta. One headline read, "Veteran pilot claims discrimination against leadership amid company scandal." The article featured an anonymous quote from a senior pilot. "This is a dangerous precedent. If every complaint leads to a witch hunt, how can we do our jobs without fear of being unfairly targeted?" David read the article with a sinking feeling. "They're trying to shift the focus to make themselves look like victims," she said to Marcus. "That's because they know they're losing," Marcus replied. "The more desperate they get, the more reckless they'll become. Just stay the course." David's resolve was tested later that week when she was asked to participate in a live interview on a major news program. The producer framed it as an opportunity to clarify Summit Airlines' position. But David knew it was also a chance for critics to publicly challenge her. "You don't have to do this," Marcus said as they prepared for the interview. "Yes, I do," David replied. "If I don't speak directly to the public, I'll look like I'm hiding something. People need to see that Summit Airlines is serious about change." The studio lights were bright, and the host, a seasoned journalist named Diane Ellis, wasted no time diving into the controversy. "Ms. Johnson, Summit Airlines has faced serious accusations in recent weeks, including claims of systemic discrimination and a toxic culture. What do you say to passengers and employees who feel their concerns haven't been taken seriously in the past?" David leaned forward slightly, her tone measured but sincere. "First, I want to acknowledge those concerns. Summit Airlines has not always lived up to the standards we set for ourselves, and for that, I want to apologize on behalf of the company. But acknowledging the problem is just the beginning. We're taking concrete steps to address these issues and ensure they don't happen again." Diane nodded but pressed further. "Some critics, including veteran employees, have accused you of targeting senior staff unfairly. How do you respond to those allegations?" David didn't flinch. "Accountability isn't about targeting individuals. It's about creating a culture where everyone is held to the same standard, regardless of their position. The changes we're making are designed to ensure fairness for all employees, from senior leadership to frontline staff. This isn't about blame. It's about building a better future for the entire Summit Airlines family." The interview continued for another 10 minutes, touching on everything from the task force's role to David's personal motivations for spearheading the reforms. When it was over, David felt a mix of exhaustion and relief. The public response to the interview was immediate. Social media lit up with hashtags like "Jarciter accountability takes flight" and "Fly with dignity." While some comments were critical, many applauded David's honesty and courage. Mia sent her a message later that night. "You were amazing. People are finally listening." David smiled, her exhaustion momentarily lifting. The fight was far from over, but for the first time it felt like progress was within reach. The public reaction to David's interview gave her team momentum, but it also heightened the stakes. The media scrutiny turned a spotlight on every corner of Summit Airlines, and what it revealed wasn't pretty. Anonymous reports began surfacing, painting a picture of a workplace plagued by unchecked egos, favoritism, and systemic neglect. For David, the growing pile of evidence was both a validation of her efforts and a sobering reminder of the magnitude of the problem. As Marcus combed through more employee testimonies, one theme became increasingly clear. Captain Hartley wasn't an outlier. He was a symptom of a much larger cultural rot. 2 days after the interview, David and Marcus met with the newly established task force, a diverse group of employees ranging from junior staff to senior managers. Among them was Mia, whose courage had inspired others to come forward. "The goal of this task force," David began, addressing the group, "isn't just to address the complaints we already know about. It's to create a structure where employees feel safe reporting misconduct and where those reports are taken seriously. We're here to uncover the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it may be." The task force members nodded, but the tension in the room was palpable. Many of them were risking their careers by participating, and everyone knew it. Mia spoke up first. I've talked to other crew members who've worked with Hartley. Some of them are too scared to speak publicly, but they've shared stories with me. He's not just disrespectful, he's retaliatory. One flight attendant was reassigned to less favorable routes after filing a complaint about him. She eventually left the airline altogether. Another member, a senior technician named Luis, added, "It's not just Hartley. I've seen captains override maintenance concerns to meet tight schedules, and no one holds them accountable. It's like the rules don't apply to them." David took notes as the testimonies poured in, each one painting a more damning picture of a company culture that prioritized profits and hierarchy over safety and integrity. Later that afternoon, Marcus pulled David aside. "I think we need to escalate this," he said, holding up a file. "What is it?" David asked. "Records from a whistleblower who used to work in HR," Marcus explained. "They claim that upper management routinely buried complaints against senior staff, especially pilots. There are even allegations that some executives pressured HR to alter or destroy records to avoid legal liability." David's jaw tightened. "Do we have proof?" Marcus nodded. "The whistleblower provided emails and internal memos. It's all here." David flipped through the file, her anger simmering beneath the surface. "This changes everything. If management was complicit, it's not just about reforming policies, it's about holding the leadership accountable." Armed with the new evidence, David and Marcus requested another meeting with the board. This time, they didn't just present data. They laid out the full extent of the misconduct, connecting the dots between Hartley's behavior, the failures of HR, and the complicity of certain executives. One memo in particular caught the board's attention. It was an email from a senior VP to HR, instructing them to handle the situation quietly regarding a complaint against Hartley. The email explicitly stated that disciplining a senior pilot would be bad for morale and optics. "This isn't just a failure of the system," David said, her voice steady but firm. "It's an active effort to suppress accountability. If we don't address this head-on, we're not just risking lawsuits, we're risking lives." The room fell silent as the weight of her words sank in. Claire Donovan, one of the board members who had been skeptical during the last meeting, finally spoke up. "This is unacceptable. If these allegations are true, we need to take immediate action, starting with a full investigation into HR and the executive team." Alan Brewster, the chairman, nodded reluctantly. "Agreed. We'll need to bring in an external firm to conduct the investigation. This is bigger than we realized." David exchanged a glance with Marcus. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a significant step forward. The external investigation began within days, and its findings confirmed what David had suspected. A culture of favoritism and fear had allowed misconduct to thrive unchecked. Senior staff wielded their influence to suppress complaints, and HR often turned a blind eye to protect the company's image. As the investigation progressed, more whistleblowers came forward, emboldened by the task force and the public attention surrounding the case. One particularly damning revelation came from a former HR manager who admitted to shredding documents related to Hartley's complaints. "I didn't have a choice," the manager told investigators. "I was following orders from above. If I refused, I would have been fired." Meanwhile, Hartley's position became increasingly untenable. With each new revelation, his defenders grew quieter, and his once loyal allies began to distance themselves. But Hartley wasn't going down without a fight. In a move that shocked even David, he filed a countersuit against Summit Airlines, claiming defamation and wrongful targeting. His legal team argued that he was being scapegoated for broader systemic issues, framing him as a victim of corporate politics. David and Marcus reviewed the countersuit together. "This is a desperate move," Marcus said, "but it could still create problems. If he drags this out in court, it could slow down the reforms we're trying to implement." David frowned. "We can't let him distract us. The truth is on our side, and we need to keep the focus on the systemic issues, not just him." Despite Hartley's countersuit, the investigation continued to uncover more evidence of misconduct and cover-ups. The task force, bolstered by new members and support from employees, began drafting proposals for a complete overhaul of the company's reporting and accountability systems. One of their key recommendations was the creation of an independent ethics committee to oversee complaints and ensure transparency. David championed the idea, knowing it would be a crucial step toward rebuilding trust within the company. By the time the investigation concluded, the report was a scathing indictment of Summit Airlines leadership. Several executives resigned in disgrace, and the HR department underwent a complete restructuring. Hartley's case was referred to an arbitration panel, and his countersuit was dismissed due to lack of merit. David sat in her office, reviewing the final report. The journey had been long and grueling, but the tide was finally turning. The airline had committed to sweeping changes, and employees like Mia were beginning to feel hopeful about the future. Marcus knocked on her door, a rare smile on his face. "You did it," he said. "We did it," David corrected, her voice tinged with exhaustion but also pride. As she looked out the window, watching a Summit Airlines plane take off into the clear blue sky, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight wasn't over, but the foundation for lasting change had been laid. The external investigation's findings sent shockwaves through Summit Airlines, but they also marked a turning point. The board's commitment to reform gained momentum, and David's task force became the centerpiece of the company's efforts to rebuild trust, both within its ranks and with its customers. For David, this wasn't just a project. It was the heart of her mission. Overhauling policies was one thing, but changing a culture required something deeper: trust. The first task force meeting after the investigation's conclusion was held in a conference room overlooking the airport runway. The symbolism wasn't lost on David as she stood at the head of the table. Planes ascended into the sky outside the window, a reminder that their work wasn't just about paperwork or meetings. It was about ensuring every passenger and employee could feel safe and respected, no matter where they were. "First, I want to thank all of you," David began, her voice steady but warm. "Your courage and dedication brought us to this moment. Without your willingness to speak out and push for change, none of this would have been possible." The task force members exchanged nods, but their expressions were a mix of determination and apprehension. The weight of responsibility hung heavy in the room. Mia, now one of the most vocal members of the task force, raised her hand. "What happens next?" "The investigation is over, but there's still a lot of mistrust out there, especially among the flight crews. Some people don't believe things will really change." David nodded. "That's exactly why we're here. Our job isn't just to recommend policies, it's to make sure they're implemented in a way that restores faith in this company. And that starts with transparency." She clicked a remote, and the first slide of a presentation appeared on the screen. Building a culture of accountability. The presentation outlined the key initiatives the task force would oversee: a new reporting system, an independent platform where employees could file complaints anonymously, ensuring their concerns were reviewed by an external ethics committee, mandatory training programs, company-wide sessions on implicit bias, conflict resolution, and workplace ethics, designed to address the root causes of misconduct. Leadership evaluations. Senior staff would undergo regular reviews, not just for performance, but also for their adherence to the company's values. "These aren't just ideas," David said, her tone firm. "They're commitments. The board has already approved funding for these initiatives, and the External Ethics Committee will ensure we're held accountable." As the meeting progressed, the task force began breaking into smaller groups to tackle specific aspects of the reform plan. Mia and a few others took the lead on redesigning the reporting system, while Luis, the senior technician, volunteered to work on the leadership evaluation process. Luis spoke up as they divided tasks. "It's not going to be easy," he said, his deep voice resonating in the room. "Some of the senior staff will resist this, especially the evaluations. They're not used to being questioned." "That's why it's so important," David replied. "Leadership sets the tone for the entire company. If they're not willing to adapt, they're not fit to lead." By the end of the day, the task force had outlined a detailed action plan. But as David packed up her notes, Mia lingered by her side. "Do you think people will believe in this?" Mia asked quietly. David paused, considering her answer. "Change takes time," she said. "But every step we take, no matter how small, is a step toward rebuilding trust. And trust isn't something you demand. It's something you earn. That's what we're doing here. Earning it." The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. The new reporting system was launched first, and within days, it received dozens of submissions. Some were new complaints, but others were from employees who had been too afraid to speak out before. One anonymous report detailed another captain's history of verbal abuse toward crew members, sparking an internal review. Unlike before, the process was transparent, and the ethics committee's findings were shared with the task force. The captain was suspended pending further investigation, sending a clear message. Misconduct would no longer be tolerated. This is what accountability looks like, David told the task force during their next meeting. People are watching, and every action we take reinforces the idea that things are changing for the better. As the reforms gained traction, David also turned her attention to the mandatory training programs. She knew these sessions couldn't just be checkbox exercises. They needed to be meaningful and impactful. She worked closely with external consultants to design workshops that went beyond generic lectures. The sessions included real-world scenarios based on incidents uncovered during the investigation, challenging employees to confront their own biases and assumptions. During the first pilot session, David sat in the back of the room, observing. The facilitator introduced a scenario where a flight attendant was ignored by a captain after raising a safety concern. "What would you do in this situation?" the facilitator asked. The room was silent at first, but then a junior pilot raised her hand. "I think I'd hesitate to push back," she admitted. "There's this unspoken rule that you don't question senior staff, even if you know they're wrong." The facilitator nodded. "That hesitation is exactly what we need to address. A healthy workplace culture empowers everyone to speak up when something's wrong, regardless of rank." David left the session feeling hopeful. The road ahead was long, but the conversations happening in those rooms were the seeds of real change. 1 month later, Summit Airlines held an all-staff town hall to share the progress made since the investigation. David stood at the podium, addressing hundreds of employees in person and thousands more watching online. "Over the past several weeks, we've taken significant steps toward building a safer, more inclusive workplace," she began. "But let me be clear, this is just the beginning. Change isn't a one-time event. It's a continuous process, and we need every single one of you to be part of that process." The response was overwhelmingly positive. Employees who had once been skeptical now saw tangible proof of the company's commitment to reform. Mia later told David that crew members were starting to talk about the changes with a sense of pride rather than fear. As David walked back to her office after the town hall, Marcus caught up with her. "You've done something incredible here," he said. "We've done it," David corrected, smiling. Marcus nodded. "But there's one thing I've learned from all this. It's not enough to fix what's broken. You have to build something better to take its place. That's what you've started, David. Don't lose sight of it." She nodded, feeling the weight of his words. The task force had made remarkable progress, but the journey was far from over. There were still skeptics to win over, policies to refine, and trust to rebuild. But for the first time, David felt a sense of hope, not just for Summit Airlines, but for everyone who believed in the power of change. The reforms at Summit Airlines were beginning to take root, but their impact extended far beyond the walls of the company's headquarters. The changes David and the task force had fought so hard to implement were starting to ripple outward, influencing not just employees but the broader aviation industry as well. For the first time in years, Summit Airlines began to earn praise from labor advocates and passengers alike. Headlines shifted from scandal to progress. Summit Airlines charts a new course with industry-leading accountability measures. David read the articles with a cautious optimism. Public perception was improving, but she knew it was fragile. Rebuilding trust took time, and every small victory had to be backed by consistent action. One of the most noticeable shifts was within the company itself. Employees who had once been skeptical of the reforms were starting to come around. The new reporting system gave them a voice, and the regular updates from the task force ensured transparency. At a staff meeting for flight crews, Mia shared her perspective. "A year ago, I wouldn't have believed any of this was possible," she said. "But seeing how the company handled recent complaints, I feel like my voice actually matters now. It's not perfect yet, but it's a start." Her words resonated with the room. Crew members nodded in agreement, and some even shared their own positive experiences with the new systems. One attendant described how her report about a captain's inappropriate comments was addressed within days, leading to a formal apology and corrective action. "It's not just lip service anymore," she said. "They're actually doing something about it." David attended the meeting quietly, sitting in the back as she listened to the employees' stories. Hearing their experiences firsthand reminded her why this work mattered. Beyond the internal changes, Summit Airlines began to attract attention from other companies in the industry. Competitors reached out to learn more about the reforms, particularly the Independent Ethics Committee and the mandatory training programs. At a conference for aviation executives, David was invited to speak on a panel about corporate accountability. As she took the stage, she couldn't help but reflect on how far things had come since that fateful flight with Captain Hartley. "Accountability isn't just about addressing problems after they occur," she told the audience. "It's about creating a culture where those problems are less likely to happen in the first place." At Summit Airlines, we've learned that transparency, employee empowerment, and leadership accountability are essential to achieving that. The audience responded with applause, and several executives approached her afterward to discuss implementing similar reforms in their own companies. Not everyone welcomed the changes, however. Within Summit Airlines, a small but vocal group of senior staff continued to resist the reforms, grumbling about unnecessary bureaucracy and eroding authority. One of them confronted David directly during a leadership meeting. "You've created a climate of fear," he accused. "Pilots are afraid to make decisions because they think they'll be second-guessed or punished." David met his glare without flinching. "What we've created is a climate of accountability," she replied. "If someone is afraid of being held responsible for their actions, perhaps they should reflect on why that is." The room fell silent, and the man sank back into his chair, muttering under his breath. David knew the resistance wouldn't disappear overnight, but she also knew she couldn't let it deter her. As the months passed, the changes at Summit Airlines began to yield tangible results. Employee satisfaction scores rose steadily, and passenger feedback improved. The airline even saw an uptick in customer loyalty, with many passengers praising the visible improvements in crew professionalism and service quality. One passenger wrote in a survey, "I've been flying with Summit Airlines for years, and I've noticed a real difference lately. The staff seems happier, more engaged, and genuinely committed to making the experience better. Whatever you're doing, keep it up." The feedback was a welcome boost for David and the task force, but it also served as a reminder of the stakes. People were watching, and any misstep could undo the progress they'd made. David's phone buzzed one afternoon as she sat in her office. It was a message from Marcus. "You've got to see this," it read, followed by a link to an article. She clicked the link and found herself reading a feature in a prominent aviation magazine, "A New Standard for Accountability: How Summit Airlines is Leading the Way." The article praised the company's reforms, calling them a model for the industry, and highlighting the role of the task force in driving change. It even included a profile of Mia, describing her journey from a hesitant whistleblower to a leader in the movement for workplace justice. David couldn't help but smile. The recognition was gratifying, but what mattered most was the validation of their work. Later that week, Mia stopped by David's office with an update on the task force's latest initiatives. "We're working on a mentorship program for junior staff," Mia explained. "The idea is to pair them with experienced employees who can guide them through the new systems and help them feel supported." "That's a fantastic idea," David said. "It's one thing to implement policies, but creating relationships like that can make the changes more personal and lasting." Mia hesitated for a moment before adding, "I just wanted to say, thank you. I know this hasn't been easy, but you've made a real difference, for all of us." David felt a lump in her throat but managed to smile. "Thank you, Mia. I couldn't have done this without you and the rest of the task force. This is a team effort." As David walked through the halls of Summit Airlines headquarters that evening, she passed by a bulletin board filled with notes from employees. Many of them were simple messages of gratitude. "Thank you for listening. Finally, a workplace we can be proud of. Accountability matters." David paused to read them, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The road to reform had been long and difficult, but it was worth every step. The ripple effect was real, and it was spreading. What had started as a fight to address one captain's misconduct had grown into a movement for systemic change. one that would shape Summit Airlines for years to come. 6 months after the investigation concluded, Summit Airlines stood at the threshold of a new era. The turbulence of internal conflicts, public scrutiny, and systemic reform had transformed the company in ways few could have imagined. While challenges remained, the path forward was undeniably brighter. For David, the past months had been a whirlwind of implementation, monitoring, and follow-through. The reforms she had championed were now firmly in place, and the results were beginning to speak for themselves. One of the most visible changes was the behavior of senior leadership. The introduction of regular performance evaluations, combined with mandatory ethics training, had reshaped the culture of accountability at the top. Executives who had previously dismissed concerns now led by example, actively engaging with employees and addressing issues before they escalated. Captain Hartley, once the focal point of the controversy, had quietly retired after his arbitration case was dismissed. Though his departure was unceremonious, it marked a turning point for Summit Airlines. Without his influence, many of his former allies softened their resistance to the reforms, realizing that the changes were here to stay. Meanwhile, the Independent Ethics Committee had become a cornerstone of the company's new approach to accountability. Its work was thorough and transparent, earning the trust of employees who had long felt ignored. The committee's quarterly reports were shared company-wide, highlighting trends, case resolutions, and areas for continued improvement. David stood before the Ethics Committee one afternoon, presenting a progress update. Behind her, a screen displayed data showing a 70% increase in employee trust ratings and a significant reduction in reported incidents of misconduct. "These numbers are encouraging," she said, addressing the committee members. "But they're not the finish line. They're a benchmark. Accountability isn't a goal we achieve once. It's a standard we uphold every day." The committee chair, a former federal mediator named Rachel Lee, nodded approvingly. "You've set a high bar, Ms. Johnson. What's next on your agenda?" "We're focusing on sustainability," David replied. "It's one thing to implement change. It's another to ensure it lasts. That means ongoing training, open communication, and constant reevaluation of our policies." Rachel smiled. "Sounds like Summit Airlines is in good hands." Outside the boardrooms and offices, the reforms were also reshaping the passenger experience. Flight crews, now empowered by the new policies, felt more confident and engaged in their roles. Passengers noticed the difference, praising the professionalism and attentiveness of the staff. At a layover lounge, Mia overheard a conversation between two passengers. "This is my first flight with Summit in years," one of them said. "I stopped flying with them after a bad experience. But this time, it's different. The crew seems happier. It feels like they actually care." Mia couldn't help but smile. Moments like this reminded her of how far they had come. One evening, David attended a celebration marking the completion of the company's first year under the new accountability program. Employees from all departments gathered in a large hangar, its walls adorned with banners bearing Summit Airlines' updated mission statement, "Flying Forward Together." As David mingled with the crowd, she felt a deep sense of pride. This wasn't just a slogan. It was a reflection of everything they had worked for. Luis, the senior technician who had joined the task force early on, approached her with a wide grin. "You've got to see this," he said, leading her to a table displaying employee feedback cards. David picked up a card and read it aloud. "Thank you for creating a workplace where we feel heard. For the first time in years, I'm proud to wear the Summit uniform." Her throat tightened as she read more cards, each one a testament to the positive impact of their efforts. "This is what we've been working for," Luis said, "and it's only the beginning." David nodded, her voice steady. "It's worth every late night, every hard conversation, every tough decision. This is why we do it." Later that night, as the celebration wound down, Marcus joined David at one of the tables. "You should take a moment to celebrate this," he said, raising a glass. "You've accomplished something most people only dream about, real, lasting change." David chuckled. "You know me, Marcus. I don't stop to celebrate until the work is done." "The work will never be done," he replied. "But that's what makes it worth doing." They clinked glasses, and for the first time in months, David allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. As Summit Airlines continued its journey of transformation, the ripple effects extended to the industry as a whole. Other companies began adopting similar accountability measures, inspired by Summit's success. Aviation conferences featured panels on ethics and transparency, with Summit's task force often cited as a model for best practices. David was invited to speak at one such conference in New York. Standing before a packed audience of industry leaders, she shared the lessons she had learned over the past year. Change doesn't come from policies alone, she said. It comes from people willing to challenge the status quo, to speak up even when it's hard, and to hold themselves and others accountable. That's what we've done at Summit Airlines, and it's what I hope others will do as well. Her words were met with a standing ovation, but for David, the real reward was seeing how her efforts were inspiring others to take action. One afternoon, back at Summit Airlines headquarters, David received an unexpected visitor. It was Mia, carrying a small gift box. "What's this?" David asked, smiling as she accepted the box. "Just a little thank you," Mia said, "for everything you've done. For me, for the crew, for the company." Inside the box was a model airplane, painted with Summit Airlines logo and the words "Flying Forward Together" inscribed on its wings. David felt a lump in her throat as she held the model in her hands. "Thank you, Mia. This means more than you know." Mia smiled. "We wouldn't be here without you." As David sat in her office later that evening, the model airplane on her desk, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The fight for accountability had been grueling, but it had also been deeply rewarding. She thought back to that first flight with Captain Hartley, the moment that had set everything in motion. What had started as a confrontation with one individual had grown into a movement for systemic change, touching the lives of thousands of employees and passengers. Looking out the window at a Summit Airlines jet taking off into the evening sky, David felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. The skies ahead were clearer now, and while there would always be challenges, she knew they were ready to face them. Summit Airlines had found its way forward, and so had she. With Summit Airlines now soaring on a path of accountability and trust, David's journey stands as a testament to the power of persistence, courage, and the belief that change is always possible. The company's transformation wasn't just about fixing policies or holding individuals accountable. It was about rebuilding an